He spent his life building an empire, believing no one could take it from him. He crushed rivals, controlled the game, and thought his legacy was untouchable. Then came her, his own daughter, the one who sacrificed everything to follow in his footsteps, only to be cast aside with 6 ruthless words. This is not for a woman. He handed her future to someone weaker, thought she'd accept it, thought she'd disappear. Instead, she did something far worse. She waited. She built her own empire, took his clients, shattered his reputation, and left him drowning in his own failure. Now, the empire he once ruled is falling apart, and the only person who can save him, the woman he betrayed. But this time, she's here to watch him burn.
His whole life he had been creating something he felt would last forever, a legal firm bearing his name, a legacy created by relentless discipline and brutal desire. Every case he prevailed on, every client he attracted, every rival he defeated was another stone in the empire he meant to pass on to the next generation. But not just any replacement though, the appropriate heir. Someone with awareness of power's weight. Someone who was deserving of it, someone like his son, not his daughter. Her childhood had been spent in his shadow, seeing him rule courts, silence rivals, and demand respect with just his presence. She held him in high regard, understood him, learned every lesson he never meant to impart to her. She knew the company far better than anyone else, knew its past, its advantages, and its shortcomings. She understood the long evenings spent reading law books, the sacrifices needed to succeed, the hunger to exist in a world that ate the unprepared. She reasoned he had seen her, thought he had seen the hours she devoted, the cases she examined, the successes she accrued in law school, considerably more than his half-hearted efforts at following in their father's footsteps. When the time arrived, when he saw the two of them side by side, she hoped he would at last accept what had been clear for years. She was the only deserving person living in his empire. But he did not hesitate when the moment came and he had to make a decision. He did not waver. He hardly turned to glance at her. This is not for a woman. 6 terms. 6 words meant to destroy everything. 6 words that let her know she had been nothing more than a naive child accepting a future never destined for her. He turned her aside as if all her work, all her sacrifices, had been nothing more than a game, handing the company to her brother, who had the talent or ambition. And let me ask you this. Have you ever been overlooked for something you deserved? Maybe a job, an opportunity, or even recognition for something you worked tirelessly on. It's a feeling that stays with you, isn't it? Let me know in the comments if you've ever experienced this kind of injustice. Pain seemed to threaten to overwhelm her momentarily. Not only suffering, betrayal is involved. A great, raw wound sliced straight through her spirit. But a wonderful thing is pain. It changes with the correct pressure, the correct conditions. It clarifies. And that evening she walked out of his office without breaking. She sobbed not. She did not ask for permission. She committed herself. She would construct her own if he would deny her the position she had earned. She would teach him what actual power felt like if he believed she was not suited for it. She would be his reckoning if he had lived believing she would never be more than his daughter. She vanished from his life for the next year, but she never really vanished. She labored. She built. She turned all he had refused to offer her into something of her own. She flourished abroad while her brother struggled with the demands of the company. She etched her reputation within the legal field with accuracy, knowledge, and relentless drive as her father watched his empire languish under poor leadership. Her triumphs were hardly meager. Their significance was not negligible. Their design sought to be felt. She surgically precisely tore apart well-publicized instances. She turned once enemies into friends. She made customers who formerly belonged to her father's company hers. Every headline including her name, every piece praising her strategic genius, every hushed discussion about the attorney no one could stop, all pointed back to him. Then fate delivered her the last piece when she had made herself indisputable and when her power had become something no one could ignore. His empire broke. She watched it long before he did. The mismanagement, the internal strife, the clients leaving, the financial pressure closing around his once unquestionably strong company like a noose. The corporation was sinking alongside the drowning son he had selected. And then, at last, when there were no choices left and the great man who had once set the path of her life found himself on the brink of disaster, he did the one thing he said he never would. He joined her. She had been waiting. Entering her office, he seemed to be a guy bearing 1,000 regrets. She sensed it in his stance, in his slow unease at realizing he was going to ask for help from the very person he had turned aside. She let the quiet extend for a moment, feel it for him. Let him experience what it meant to be helpless before another person. Then at last he said. He related to her what had transpired, told her about the company's problems, the cases they were losing, and the financial threats hovering over them like a storm just ready to strike. He informed her about the clients who had departed, about the rivals gathering like vultures, about the great demand for someone who could mend what was broken. At last too he explained her why he was there. He was dependent on her. The girl he had turned aside, the woman he had decided not worthy, the attorney he had never believed in. She paid attention. Unreadable expression, constant heart. She leaned forward, laying her palms on the desk between them, when he was finished and when he finally stopped and waited for her response. She then rebuilt the ending to fit their story using slow, measured phrases. "This is not for a man like you." She watched the instant he comprehended. The instant he understood the power he had denied her had just grown rather than vanished. But it no longer benefited him. It never would once again. Not always does revenge manifest itself as blood and violence. Sometimes it's still cold. A signature on a contract permanently changing the power distribution. A court decision erasing an empire. A whisper of truth that guarantees the earth never forgets. Sometimes retribution is seeing the man who once saw you as nothing realize that ultimately you were never simply his daughter. Among his mistakes, yours were the best ones. He had always felt that power was his inheritance, that the empire he had created over decades would remain untouchable, a monument to his ambition and merciless drive, unchallenged. He could hardly identify the man he had grown to be, though, as he sat in the low light of the courtroom and his world collapsed around him, not with a boom, but with the subdued, relentless force of his daughter's painstakingly created wrath, his legacy was erasing. Now every whispered story, every headline in the legal journals, every frightened gesture in the boardrooms of his former allies confirmed that she was not only his reckoning, she had turned his rejection into the fuel that set off a firestorm of retaliation. She had emerged as a force of nature in that heated environment, where the air itself seemed to spark with the tension of a war long overdue, a tempest that swept over every last trace of his kingdom, leaving only wreckage in her wake. Once full of the anguish of betrayal, her eyes now gleamed with a hard, steely determination that touched him right down. He had undervalued the strength of a mother rejected, of a daughter whose every step had been a quiet protest against a fate she never chose. Every argument she presented during the trial destroyed his meticulously created perfect facade. With every counter, she chipped away at the foundation of his power, revealing not only the moral conundrums and financial disparities of his company operations but also the ingrained arrogance that had blinded him to his own shortcomings. She talked with the conviction of someone who has spent many hours alone, considering the cost of pride and the actual definition of justice. Once his haven, the courtroom had become a theater of poetic retribution where every word, every gesture, every deliberate silence was meant to destroy the empire he had so painstakingly created. The cosmos seemed to have worked to lead him to this precise moment, a moment when the daughter he had written off as unworthy now presided over his doom. Every bit of evidence she offered, every legal trick she used, was a silent critique of the guy who had once laughed at her dreams, who had haughtily said the world of power and reputation was not suited for her. Her battle was about regaining her dignity, about rewriting the story that had been forced on her from the very beginning, not only about winning a case in that instant as she methodically untangled the web of his dishonesty. Long proud of his untouchability, a master of the game where only the toughest survive. Here he was caught in a situation of his own creating, seeing in horror as every mistake, every secret vice, every unethical choice was exposed before a jury once praised him. The evidence was overwhelming, a trail of financial wrongdoing, covert bargains, and moral concessions that portrayed a man who had surrendered everything, including his own integrity, at the altar of ambition. And the courtroom went into a heavy quiet as the last arguments were delivered, broken only by his gasping breaths and the consistent, relentless beat of justice being administered. When the decision was ultimately announced, it was not only a legal loss, it was a total annihilation of the empire he had so fervorously embraced. Once a soaring emblem of triumph, his company went bankrupt. His reputation, painstakingly developed over a lifetime of conquests, was suddenly destroyed. He looked up in that terrible moment of loss to see his daughter staring at him, not with triumph or gratification but with a calm, inevitable face. Her eyes showed no joy, no nasty smirk of retribution. Rather, there was a deep, relentless calm, as if she had been waiting for this moment for years, fully knowing that the last act of retribution was about restoring balance to a world tarnished by his unbridled pride rather than about personal vengeance. She spoke gently, her voice bearing the weight of every wrong, every restless night, every sacrifice that had resulted in this turning point as he battled to reconcile the man he once was with the shadow of his previous self. "This was never about you," she murmured, her words cutting like a last, permanent sentence. That moment let him see her struggle was a deep statement of self-affirmation rather than only a need for retribution. She had chosen a road that accepted the prospect of atonement by responsibility and honesty, one that rejected the poisonous legacy of his tyranny. For her, the courtroom was not only a battlefield but also a furnace in which the sins of the past were cleansed, therefore freeing the weight of patriarchal hubris off her future. And so he was left with nothing but the painful awareness that he had been a lesson rather than a legacy as the last echoes of the gavel vanished into the stillness of that fatal day. His kingdom, his reputation, his identity, all painstakingly created, everything jealously defended, had been reduced to nothing more than a warning story of hubris and the unavoidable fall that follows unrestrained authority. The reality became clear in that moment of complete devastation as he sat among the wreckage of his previous glory. The exact qualities he had once praised in himself, the drive, the ambition, the merciless search of success, had become his undoing. And standing before him was the person who personified the opposite of his legacy, a woman who had turned suffering into purpose, rejection into resiliency, and whose quiet, relentless drive had destroyed an empire built on injustice. He could only stare in silent misery as she turned to go, leaving him to confront the broken shards of his dreams, the finality of her words resonating in the cavernous emptiness of his collapse. Only the harsh, relentless fact that his time had come to end, no second act for him or atonement. Her success in the great fabric of life was more than just the triumph of a daughter over her father. It was evidence of the transforming power of hardship and the resiliency of a spirit that refused to be quieted. And so, as the courtroom emptied and the world outside continued its indifferent march forward, the man who had once ruled was left to face the unavoidable truth that his greatest achievement had been his undoing, and that true power was never about dominance or control. It was about the ability to rise, to rebuild, and to find meaning in the ruins of one's own making. He stayed sitting, staring at the polished wooden desk before him but seeing nothing as the echoes of the courtroom's last ruling subsided. His collapse smushed against his chest, choking, unrelenting. Once so firm, so authoritative, his hands shook on the chilly tabletop. The whispers had started, low murmurs among the viewers, the legal experts, the reporters furiously writing notes around a newly dead body. Not only was this a loss, this was extinction. Once the crown gem of the legal scene, his company was now permanently damaged. The board would act fast to take him off. His so-called devoted pals, the partners, would disperse, either supporting rivals or worse her. Unable to withstand the humiliation of failure, his chosen golden heir, his son, had already vanished from public view. And daughter? She had already turned her back on him and left the courtroom carrying the same peaceful assurance she had always possessed. Grand gestures and last insults were not necessary here. She had done as she came to do. She had triumphed. He forced himself to move by exhaling gently. Like chains, the weight of condemnation enveloped him, each step out of the courtroom heavier than the previous. Outside, the press was dense, cameras flashing like lightning, reporters yelling his name, demanding responses. Once, he would have caught their eye with one glance, his presence sufficient to silence a room. He was simply a relic of a collapsing empire now. He remained silent, did not respond. Right by them, his driver was already waiting. Except for his own breathing, the noise of the world was sealed away the instant he closed the car door, leaving him in quiet. He hardly could see the city blurring by the windows. Every choice he made, every error he committed, every moment that had brought him to this point ran through his head. Had it begun the day he selected his son above hers? Alternatively, had the seeds been grown long before that, in the manner he had raised them, in the ideals he had either failed to inculcate or had she had started her fight right away? Now, clearly than ever, he recalled it. She had pushed, questioned, always seeking more as a little child. He had written it off as stubbornness, as revolt, never seeing it for what it really was, strength. Strength he had overlooked, undervalued, dreaded. His phone danced on his hand. A letter. She wasn't the source of it. From his board of directors, was it? A last formal warning of his absence. Effective right away. He took a deep gulp, the taste of destiny coating his mouth unpleasant. There was nowhere left to go, first of all in his life. No firm to go back to, no friends to call upon, no power left to wield. To last over time, he had created an empire, but he had not seen that time belonged to people who could adapt, those who changed. and he had insisted on not changing. His car stopped in front of his estate, the tall home that had once stood for his fortune now feeling too big, too vacant. Silence met him like an old adversary as he entered. Not one phone call, not one meeting, not one pressing case calling his attention. Just calm. He passed the big staircase, past the trophies that were meaningless, past the pictures capturing a guy who no longer existed, and he slumped into his chair in his office, where his biggest triumphs had once been determined, breathing sharply. He let himself to feel the whole weight of his collapse for the first time. Still, underneath the guilt and the loss there was something else. A little, nearly invisible sense of release. Since nothing remained to fight for now, none of any empire to defend, not expectations to keep in mind. He had gone without everything, and perhaps just maybe, that allowed him to at last see what had always been in front of him. His daughter had not wrecked him. She had compelled him to confront reality. That power did not constitute control. That legacy did not consist in dread. And that believing his own flesh and blood was never destined to reign was the biggest error he had ever committed. She had created something surpassing his might, and at last, she had shown she had never required his permission to act.
Not all revenge is loud. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and devastating. He learned that the hard way. But some people, they don't just wait, they plan. And in the next story, someone is about to execute the perfect act of destruction. A stolen fortune, a buried truth, and a woman holding all the cards. She isn't just exposing the lie, she's ending it. Trust me, you won't want to miss this. Click now and watch it all unravel.